So what I'm going to go over in this video is the various styles of masks. Masks are really useful in Photoshop because they allow for you to bring in exterior images and erase parts of them without permanently deleting those pixels, without permanently deleting that information, which makes it a little bit more forgiving when you're manipulating content, when you're manipulating visuals. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to actually replace one of these eyes with a frog eye. So before you do anything, you might need to download it. So like I'm going to go over briefly about how search engines works and the most effective way of bringing in an image, but then at that point you probably want to pause the video, download your eye, or bring it in. So let's go to a search engine, and I already have it up. I Google searched frog eye, and then I clicked on images. So with these, are what I have up. Now, if you want to make sure that you're not using, copyright infringement, there's a bunch of settings. If you want to make sure that you have a high quality image that you're bringing into Photoshop, there are these various settings that benefit you that way too. So if you click on Tools, you can change the size to large, and this makes sure it's big. It doesn't necessarily mean it's high res enough for your image, but it does narrow the content down a bit. You can also narrow it down by color if you want, unnecessary since we're using grayscale. And then you can also label reuse with modification. Now what that means is that hypothetically you're legally allowed to utilize these. So here's a Wiki Commons eye, and we'll use this one. But the other thing that you need to be aware of is that even with Wiki Commons, sometimes you're required to credit the author. So make sure that you go to the web address to make sure that this is allowed. So in this case it says that you can share it, you can adapt it, but you have to give the appropriate credit or provide a link to the license to indicate the changes that you made, etc., etc. So you have to make sure it's okay to use it for now because we're doing this for educational purposes. I'm not concerned in this particular assignment if all of your information isn't public domain, but it's a good habit to get used to. You're not selling these images, these are exercises, so it's fine. Many things are fair use in the context of education, not in the context of commercially making a textbook, but in the context of you learning something. So just be aware of that. So that helps. If we click on the image, you'll see this. A common mistake is to drag this image over to Photoshop. Now you don't want to do this because this still isn't the high resolution image. This is just a display image that Google search generates to show you a better idea of what this looks like. To access the actual high resolution image, you have to either right click or control click on it. So I'm control clicking, and I'm going to go to Open Image in New Tab. What Open Image in New Tab does is it creates an additional tab that has the actual image file in it. If you don't do that, you're going to be pulling this basically displayed photo. So now with this selected, as you can see, it's significantly larger, and in this case it's higher quality. Now there's two ways to bring an image into Photoshop. You could just click and drag it over to your file. The problem with this is that it doesn't always work this well, where it's the actual size it's supposed to be, etc. Oftentimes it'll try to stretch it out to the external area. This also happens with file place embedded sometimes, so just something to be aware of. Another way to do this is to go to the image and drag it over to the Photoshop icon. And this is what I prefer personally because it just guarantees that I can go to do things like go to image size and make sure that it's the right size. So it's 14 by 10 at 72. I'm going to make it at 300. As you can see, the width and height didn't change, so I know that there's a problem. Uncheck resample. So this is the biggest this image can be, 3 by 2 inches. So now I'm going to hit, I can either create a selection similar to what we did with the torn and before and torn after. And I can just copy, hitting Command C, go to my, I'm going to delete this layer, go to my image and hit Command V. And I can actually copy this image into the space. So, several ways of doing this. you can choose your own personal preference. So to talk about masks. Again, masks are an incredibly useful tool because you can erase things without permanently deleting those pixels. I'm going to show you 4 different ways of doing this. The first way is the way that I originally learned when I first started using this software, and the first option that they had available. Now they've since added multiple other pathways to it, and there's even recently yet another option that was built that I'll talk a little bit briefly about. Has been added to Photoshop. It's a little buggy, it doesn't work in every situation, but just showing you that it exists. So there's these icons down here on your layers panel. If you don't have your layers panel already up, pause, make sure that you find your layers panel. One of these little buttons that are down here is a square with a circle. And as you can see, when I hover over it, it says add layer mask. Now I need to make sure that layer 1 is highlighted before I do this so that I know it is the correct layer, the one that I want to apply a mask to. When I click on it, this little white box appears. That white box is the layer mask. Now I can tell that it's currently selected because of these little brackets on the side. If I click on my image, now I'm manipulating only my image. You want your masks selected. Then I'm going to go to the paintbrush tool. It looks like a paintbrush. You can use this to do digital illustration. You can use it to paint color. You can also, we're going to use it for our mask. So with masks, the way they work is that when you paint black on a mask, it will remove content visually. If you paint white on the mask, it adds the content back. So we're going to go up here, and we have the same brush tool options. I'm going to leave it at a hardness of 0 because I want it to blend. I'm going to, you can apply opacity, you can make the mode whatever you want, but normal is what is best for this situation. It looks very similar to what we saw with the clone stamp tool. So a lot of this should be already new. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now click and drag my mouse across this content. And as you can see, it's starting to erase it. We're basically doing kind of like the inverse of what we did with the clone stamp tool. Kinda, not exactly, but kinda. And I might want to shrink this down, to get a little bit more accurate in some of these areas. Now one thing you might notice about this frog eye is that it is blurred on this right side. And this is where those blur tools work really well. Now it's much easier to make things blurry than it is to sharpen them. So if I go back to my sharpen tool again, and I start to sharpen this area, there's some issues. I could also go to my dodge and burn tool that we went over to darken that area because it's also a little bit lighter. And that's helping a little bit, but it's starting to build this sort of texture that's going to make it obvious that I used Photoshop. So let's go ahead and undo those. Oops, a little bit too far. And what you might do is you might go to your background layer, the layer with the image on it, and I might blur that area so that it matches the eyeball. You see? And now it feels a little bit less of a problem. And I could blur this side of my face too so that it kind of matches. It feels a little bit more natural, like there's a depth of field thing happening. Another thing that you can also do between these two to help them is that, as you can see, this seems a little bit more richer in contrast, and this is something you're going to have to do. It's much easier to increase contrast than decrease contrast. So if I want my image to match this eye better, I might go to Image, Adjustments, and go to those levels and increase my dark shadows. And you see already it's starting to feel a little bit closer to that frog eye. And this is something you're gonna hear me say or type to you through email occasionally when you're working on your projects to help it look a little bit better, to help it match your image a little bit better. So I'm going to go ahead and undo some of that content using my history timeline, right? And I'm going to click on my mask, and there's a couple other options. Actually, let's go up here. I want to talk about a couple other things. So when you move go to the Move tool right now, it moves all your content, the mask and the image, together. If you hover over to this chain link between the two, it basically severs that connection. When I click on it, it allows me to move the image independently of my mask and my mask independently of the image. So if I click on it, you see it's gone now. When I use my Move tool, I'm moving the mask now. You see, so that shape, it looks really weird because that shape is, not the way. It's a very odd shape. You can see an image of it, or kind of a thumbnail of it over here. If I click the image, I can move and adjust the eyeball within the mask. And if I get too far up, it starts to appear on the edge outside the mask. This can be really useful in certain situations when you're trying to apply textures to things. So just be aware that it exists. If you're not happy with your mask at all and you just want to start from scratch, you can do so by clicking on the mask and dragging it over to the trash can. One other thing to go over, so if I make a mask, and if black makes things disappear, white things make stuff appear, and I'll demonstrate that. So the black is causing things to disappear. If I go too far, I can hit either the swap option right here to switch the foreground and background, or you can hit the key command X, or I can double click and make it white, and I can paint back in areas. That's what makes the mask tool really useful. But if the white brings things back and the black erases things, then gray, what it does, something that's in the middle, kind of makes things translucent. It's not exactly 100% gone, but it's not exactly all there either. So just another thing to be aware of. And again, white brings things back, so that you're not permanently getting rid of content. And then you can always drag the mask down to delete it. So Quick Mask. Quick Mask is down here underneath your colors. When you click on it, you'll notice that your layer becomes pink. You need to make sure your foreground color is black, and you're going to use your paintbrush. Now the reason people like this is because you can see this red kind of translucent color. This is what the mask will be, and it makes it a little bit easier to see where your things are going. That's why people like it. And then if you paint white, and again I swap my fill in my foreground, it erases the content. It's pretty much similar to what we were using previously. So I'm going to click on Quick Mask again. Right now it's in edit mode, and you see like this selection appears. Now what's interesting about the mask option, and this is true of all selections, is they can be turned into masks. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that next. That's going to be our third way of creating masks. So when you click on the mask icon now, it converts that into a mask. Now, we want the inverse of this. And the reason that I did this intentionally, because I wanted to show you that with masks, there's actually ways to manipulate whether or not you invert or add contrast to the colors on the mask itself. Well, not the colors, but the tonal values. So if I go to Image, Adjustments, Invert now, it swaps my mask. And what's another option too that makes this even more interesting, you see how these edges I don't want, I can just go back to approaching it similar to what I did previously with masks to clean up this too. So like you can use different options for masks simultaneously to some degree. Like some of them don't exactly directly work with each other, but there's a lot of ways to approach this. So I'm going to click and drag this over to delete it again. So I can show you those other options. So selection. If I draw a rectangle, and this works for any selection, and you can add to it with say right now I'm adding to it with the polygon lasso tool. And these are all tools that you should already know how to use, which is why I'm not really going over them too well. So now I have this crazy shape. If I click mask, it converts that into a mask. So that selection is now what we see. That's our window into the way that this visibly looks. Now if I double click the mask, that's what I just did. Let me do it again so it's not as quick. This mask icon, when I double click it, I get this property option. And you can also access it here by clicking on this icon. And what's cool about this is I can change the overall edge of my mask to clean it up. I can change the overall density of the mask. These become really useful. Another option is under Refine. If you click on this, you can change all kinds of options. So feathering, I'm going to change you can change the transparency, so whether or not you see it in its entirety. At 100%, we're not going to see the image underneath, but you might want to. Depends on your preference. What feathering does, and this is the case of even selections have feathering options, it's how soft the edge is from that selection. So you can increase it or you can decrease it. You can also shift the overall edge of the mask. You can clear it entirely. There's a lot of different options in this particular box. And that is something you can do with all mask options. You can always double click the mask, and then there's that refine option within it that allows you to manipulate it even more calculatedly. So that's pretty much it. That one's pretty simple. Now that you already understand the concepts of masks, hopefully. Let's go ahead and click and drag that into the trash can to delete it. Go ahead and click delete. And I'm going to show you the fourth way of utilizing masks. And you might be asking, like, why are you showing me all these different ways? I can just use one of them. Well, it's because different people have different preferences. Also, sometimes you'll find that one approach is going to be more effective than another approach for this particular thing that you're trying to do. Okay, so last masking tool option. This masking tool option is kind of neat. It's something that I learned relatively recently, and it utilizes the pen tool. And there's some assets in utilizing the pen tool to create a mask. There's some interesting ways that it's a little bit different than the other three. So for those of you who got really used to using the pen tool in Illustrator and feel very confident in it, this might be beneficial for you, but just to warn you, it does behave a little bit strange compared to the way the pen tool works in Illustrator. So we're going to click right here. This is where the pen tool is located. If you have any of these, you don't have the correct icon up. You need the regular pen tool. I'm going to zoom in just so I can see. Again, that analogy where it's kind of like trying to hit a target from far away versus closer to you, with a dart. I'm going to click, and just like before, I'm going to follow this edge of the eye, just like we would a shape. And I'm going to click again and drag my mouse to build those Bezier handle tools because it's a curve. Now the way it's different is that if I click back on that anchor point, before it would get rid of the Bezier handle, but it doesn't in Photoshop for whatever reason. The other thing is that you don't see that ghosted line, and that's another behavior that's a little bit different for those of you who really appreciated that option. So I'm going to click again, and if the curve isn't correct at this point, what you can do and what you're going to have to do now is you hold your Option key down or Alt key down, and when you go over to the edge, you see your icon changes. That allows me to adjust the curve, and that's pretty much like the best you can do in this particular situation. And then you would click and drag again, and then click and drag. Now once you have this path, you have direct selection tools and path selection tools. So that's really useful. I only ever use the direct selection tool. Sometimes I use path selection tool, but usually just this one. They're just not located at the top anymore. And these allow you to go back in and select individual points to, again, tighten up your overall shape if you need to, and to play with those Bezier handles as well. So I have this path. If you go to your layer panel area. You have channels and paths. We're not going to go over channels. We're going to go over paths. Now, if you click on that tab, what that tab does is it displays various options for manipulating a path. And this is really useful right now because we actually set this to path instead of shape. Now you can use shapes, and if you use the shape option that I told you not to use in the beginning, it basically is like you're creating shapes in Illustrator, but in Photoshop. Not as complicated, you can't make as complex things, but you still can make shapes just like you can in Illustrator. Okay, so go to Paths, and when you click on that Paths tab, this is our work path. This is kind of the thumbnail of it in relation to the artboard. And then down here, there's all these other options. Right now, it's already a path, so this is closed out. But you can change it to a selection. You can add a stroke to the path. You can fill in the path. And then over here, there's an Add Layer Mask. That's what we're going to click. Now the first time you click it, it doesn't do anything, so you have to click it twice. I don't know why you have to click it twice, but that's what you have to do. And if we click back on our layers, you'll see that path now appears. So let's do that. And you see here is our layer path. You can see that content disappeared. And what makes this different than what we had before and makes it really interesting is that we can change the path in real time. And that's really nice in certain situations. It'll give you a little bit more access to manipulating the content. And then if you double click it, and you have, I gotta select the mask. If you double click it, you can go to Select and Mask just like before, and you can play around with how soft or how intense the overall content is. That becomes like a really useful kind of option. So I can, feather it and these kinds of things. Oops, I want to use that one. There we go. Feather it. You see? And then that makes it, nicer, and you can also change density, of course, just like before. You can't go to Select and Mask. It doesn't have those kinds of options. But you can at least play around with that edge and how harsh it is. And that's pretty much the last of those masking tools. And then I'm going to go over a couple other things that I go over before, but we might be using different images, and to make sure that it works for what I'm trying to demonstrate. All right.